Michael Hyatt. Thanks again for joining us for the Free to Focus Productivity Summit. I'm here with my good friend, Greg Mckeown. In case you don't know him, Greg is a New York Times bestselling author of Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. He's gone on to consult with clients like Adobe and Apple and Google and Facebook. He has countless leaders pursuing the art of less but better, including me. And I've asked him to come on today to talk about productivity and how we can be more productive without being overwhelmed with all of life's demands. And if you find something particularly interesting, go ahead and post it in social media, but use the hashtag #FreeToFocus. Greg, welcome. Great to see you again, buddy.
Oh, it's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. You made such a huge impact on my life. Your book, Essentialism, was probably one of the top 3 or 4 books I've read in the last 5 years.
It's such a compliment. I mean, coming from somebody who knows books and knows productivity as well as you do, I take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It was very consequential. Hey, for people that don't know your story as well, could you kind of start at the beginning and lead us up to where you're at today?
Well, I mean, looking back, there was a bit of a key moment, a decision point, when I got an email from my boss at the time, and it said, look, Friday would be a very bad time for your wife to have a baby. I mean, she was expecting, otherwise that would be an even worse email to receive. But there it is, and Friday, in fact, is the time that my wife goes into labor, and we're in the hospital, and my daughter is born well, and everybody's well. But instead of being focused on what is clearly the essential thing for that day and longer, I was caught in this question of how can I do both? And so I was just told, well, can I keep everybody happy? Can I go to this client meeting that I've been asked and expected to attend? And so to my shame, I go to the meeting. I leave the hospital, go to the meeting, and afterwards I remember my boss said, the client will respect you for the choice you just made. And I'm not sure that they did. The look on their faces did not evince that sort of confidence. But even if they had, surely I had made a fool's bargain, violated my own integrity, done something that was clearly less important. And so in hindsight, what I learned from the experience was if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. And so ultimately I left the company and went on to start my own research into why it is that we do what we do. Why is it that so many people today feel stretched too thin at work or at home, are busy but not productive, feel like they have to say yes to please or just to avoid trouble? And this is, the work that I now do, it grows out of that painful experience and the research that has happened as a result.
The thing I love about that story is it's like nothing in life is wasted. You know, if you're alert, even something that can be a really negative thing can be the sort of the seed for something greater for what has now become your life work.
Yeah, I think that it's something worth really holding on to in the midst of challenges. I feel like life goes through periods of test and then wane and test again. And in the periods of test, that's really where all the learning is happening. But we wish it wasn't that way. We wish we could learn in the wane periods, in the easy periods. But I think we learn a lot more in the testing period. And so holding on to that idea that this test is teaching me, even if I don't know the lessons yet. It's making me something that I wasn't before and is necessary. The universe, I found, if we spend too long in the wane period, it wants its parts back. And so exactly we have to go through these tests. I sort of wish it wasn't so, but I'm sure it's supposed to be that way.
Well, we mentioned briefly your book, Essentialism. Tell us about the title. What does that title mean? What is essentialism? How do you define that?
It's the cure to a problem. It's the antidote to a problem. And the antidote is the undisciplined pursuit of more. And so here we have, I noticed the phenomenon working with companies in Silicon Valley. They're focused on a few things in the beginning, small team, on the right things at the right time. So that leads to success. But what comes with success is options and opportunities. And that sounds like the right problem to have, but it does in fact turn out to be a problem if it leads to what Jim Collins has called the undisciplined pursuit of more. And so what I found to my surprise is that success can become a catalyst for failure. So that's true not just for companies in Silicon Valley. It's true for companies more broadly, and it's also true for people more broadly in society now, because society has fallen into the undisciplined pursuit of more, this busyness bubble that everyone seems to be affected by. And so essentialism is the antidote to that problem. Essentialism is the disciplined pursuit of less but better.
Well, one of the things that I think we face in our society, and many high achievers, people that are watching this particular summit, they kind of worship at the altar of busyness. You know, they think if their calendars are full, if their to-do list is brimming over the top, then somehow they're important, or they're doing something meaningful. Why is that philosophy wrong, and what's a better alternative?
Well, I actually sometimes think about this in the opposite way, where I say, look, if it's working for you, if it's working for somebody watching this to say yes to everyone and everything without really thinking about it, if it's giving what non-essentialism always promises to give, which is everything. The idea is, non-essentialism's value proposition is, say yes to everyone and everything, and you'll get everything you want in life. And if that's what's happening for you, if a person is simply pursuing that strategy and getting that result, they should keep doing it and ignore me and ignore everything to do with essentialism. But on the basis that a lot of people watching this will recognize that trying to do it all does not produce the promised reward, then they can at least open their, the option that they've been sold a bill of goods, that they've been sold a philosophy that actually turns out to be a lie, that isn't right. That if you try and do everything for everyone all the time with no real discipline and no real strategy, that you won't break through to the next level. You'll actually plateau in your progress. Sure, you might become the go-to person. Oh yes, if I've got a problem, I just give it to that person. There's a certain level of value in that. But what you might also be finding over time is the quality of your work is going down, the stress of your life is going up. In fact, I just got an email just yesterday or the day before from the wife of a surgeon who's, it's an curious story, his hands were starting to get this whole rash on them, and they could not work out what the cause of it was, but it was getting so serious that it almost seemed like it might end his career as a surgeon. So they're reading Essentialism on the 30-hour road trip that they were going on, and they create this whole new plan and strategy, removing things from his life, all sorts of commitments that he uncommitted from, and he got his life back. Well, turns out that his business partner quit on him with a month's notice, and so suddenly he's got all of these extra clients that come along. This is a few months after they'd made the changes, and she wrote in the email, Essentialism was not just life-changing. It might literally have been life-saving for him, because she's quite sure he would have actually literally had a heart attack if he tried to adopt these new things without having created this buffer. And so, you can see there someone who's successful, someone's driven, someone who had bought into the logic of non-essentialism, was reaping the actual rewards of non-essentialism, who was able to get to a whole nother level of contribution and quality of life, personally and professionally, because they pursued a different strategy.
There's so many questions based on that illustration I want to ask you, but here's one that comes to mind. Is there an early warning system that can keep us from having to get to the point where we end up in the emergency room, or we have the rash on our hands, or our spouse walks out the door, or we have a crisis with our kids? Is there an early warning system that somehow something fundamental needs to change?
It's an awfully good question. I mean, I find that you need a cadence of looking at your life these days, because the very nature of 24/7 social media, phone that can interrupt you literally any time, day or night, and often does. The reality of that is that we are going to live reactively, and sometimes so very reactively that we are not absorbing even the natural triggers that our body is sending to us all the time. The natural triggers of stress that, I've got a headache. Why do I have a headache? Let me pause and think about what's going on in my life. I'm not sleeping correctly. I'm not sleeping. I'm sleeping 4 hours a night. And that's creating all the, we're not even noticing that. So I think that the thing to do is not even look for early warning systems exactly. It's create an early warning cadence of reflection. So I'm not sure if that phrase exactly makes sense, but I think if people hold a personal quarterly offsite, so every 90 days they're standing fully back from their life. I mean, they just pause this right now, in fact, and they just put on their calendar 90 days from now and a repeat for the next year. And they start with 2 or 3 hours maybe. Eventually you stretch it to a day because it becomes so valuable. And in that, you reflect on your life. You look at what's going on. What am I doing? What are the successes? What are the strain points? You review the next 3 months. What are the big things coming up? What are the things I can start removing? And you start to build insight into this life that's being lost because there's no space to think. That's a place to begin.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been fascinated with this whole idea of margin, and it seems like everything in our world conspires, including our own hearts, to eradicate margin. We have to be busy the entire time we're awake, and through the weekends and evenings and vacations. And I was doing an interview earlier this week, and somebody said, "What were your vacations like 20 years ago when you're in the corporate world?" And I said, "Well, all I did was change the location, but I kept working just like I was working anywhere else."
There isn't a vacation.
There isn't a vacation. No. But why is it that in 21st century world, at least in the Western world, we have this fear of empty space or of margin?
Well, I think, it starts to get quite serious here, right? But I think that it's easier to face your phone than it is to face your life. It's that it's sort of, I think it's vanity. That's what I think. I was just reading a dictionary that was published in the 1800s, which is a really important thing to do from time to time because the definitions of words have changed. And so going back to some of the core root definitions of words, I think helps us to adopt a different way of thinking. Sometimes literally words, as their meaning changes, they get this sort of malware entered into them. And we could talk about some specific examples. But as I was doing this, I was looking up vanity. And the whole idea of vanity is something that's just not real. It's something you're consumed with, something that is somehow attractive socially or just is a surface desire. But that actually, once you get the things that vanity suggests you should have, you're going to have a very empty life. And I think this is often what is really going on, is that we are consumed with many things and busyness and requests and not just requests, but just, reading the news and being a news junkie and following the latest political outburst. There's lots this season to consumers. And all of this is keeping us away from facing something deeper, which is, look, what am I supposed to be doing in my life? What direction am I in? And I think I can go a little bolder in saying that I think there's only really two kinds of people in the world, which is pretty simplistic way of saying it. But there are people who are lost, and then there are people who know they are lost. And I want to be in the second category. I want to face it. I want to face it each day. I want to go, I don't know what I'm. Let's look at the success of the past. Let's start explore. I don't know where I'm supposed to go, so I can pause and think about what really is the next thing I want to be doing.
That's very good. As you were talking about vanity, I was thinking, why is it when I get overwhelmed and when I'm in a busy season, why am I saying yes when I know I should be saying no? And some of it's definitely vanity. I want to be admired. I want to be thought highly of by my colleagues and my peers and, people in the industry and all the rest. Some of it, I think, and this is a difficult thing to unpack, is I want to be helpful. I feel like I sort of have a duty or an obligation to serve other people. How do you, in your own life, try to separate and kind of tease all that out and discern between what you say yes to and what you say no to?
Well, I think this is an important distinction that I didn't write a book called Noism. It's not about saying no to everyone and everything without thinking about it any more than it's saying yes to everyone and everything. It's about designing a life of highest contribution.
Mm.
So I am really seriously interested in my own life and in everything I'm trying to share with other people, in pursuing service, in pursuing love, in pursuing making a difference and a contribution to your own family first, to your wider community, and even to the world. I believe in that, and I think it's really important. So essentialism is not about moving into some sort of more selfish way of living. Now, having said that, there's so many things I think we do in the name of being good, in the name of being nice, helping people out, even that is really something else underneath it. That it's really more to do with, maybe liking the feeling of being needed in a situation, or maybe even as a distraction from what we're really supposed to be doing. Sometimes it's just easier to do this. I remember reading a story about a man who was busy in church, really busy at church, helping out. And when he got really honest about it, he said, look, it's just easier to help out here than it is to go and fix my relationship with my teenage son. And
wow.
So even where I'm all in favor of people helping out in church and serving there, and I do myself, but if we are doing that at the cost of something more important, then I think that's a form. It's a strong way to say this. There's a form of sin. I mean, one of the root ideas of sin is to miss the mark. Right. And I like that name. I like that idea. That it's any time we're just getting off of the path we're really supposed to be on the path of highest contribution. And that's our obligation. It's not to do everything that we could do that's good. It's not to do everything that other people are doing that's good. Our obligation is to live the most essential path, the most important contribution that we can uniquely make in the world.
Yeah, I love that. Perfect. Talk about the idea of trade-offs. You talk about this in the book, and I thought it was huge in terms of coming to grips with this yes versus no decision.
You have, if I was going to write the non-essentialist manifesto, the counter argument to essentialism, I would begin by the idea of, look, just pretend there are no trade-offs. What your job is to just, whenever you're faced with two different things that are both good, say yes to both of them, go after both of them, because by definition, they're good. And this is the non-essentialist argument. The problem with that is that you cut out all opportunity for competitive advantage, which is all to do with making different trade-offs than somebody else is making, your competition is making. But it also takes out so many of the chances to go big on something, to do something that's a breakthrough result. And so trade-off, we just finished watching the Olympics, and you see these extraordinary performances. Do we believe for a second that they didn't make trade-offs in order to achieve these levels of performance? I always think it would be fun to have someone of average ability, just normal ability, on the diving boards next to the people that are doing this in the Olympics, or on in the gym with the people doing gymnastics, to show how far they've come, to how extraordinary these people are. They've done it by trade-off. And the power of trade-off, we've got to think of it not as a negative idea, to embrace trade-offs, to recognize that this is the key to all strategic advantage, personally or professionally, individually or as an organization. That's where power begins in this journey towards becoming an essentialist. You go, I can make different trade-offs, therefore I can reasonably expect to have different outcomes than the other people around me who are trying to do a bit of everything.
But that does require, if we're going to capitalize on those trade-offs, is realize that they exist. That it is a trade-off. It is a zero-sum game. But we have to be willing and able to say no to the things that are not part of our essential calling.
Yes, I think that's necessary. We were just talking just before we had we went live. In my own life, I'm grappling with this over the last few months. I have this desire to write another book, and I have that book idea, and certainly more than one, in fact, but really passionate ideas, things that I think can make a difference, a market that I think is actually interested to receive it, at least see what's next. There's a lot of money in it too. I mean, if the first book did all right, so there's more in the next one, and all the while, I think there's another project, a different project I'm really supposed to be working on, something that's scarier for me, something that's that I don't know how to do, and I'm just pretending to go after that big idea until I say no to the book. What I want to do and what I have tried to do is how do I do both? It's back to that same idea. Well, how can I shove them both in there? Maybe I could do the book, and the book would be a great launching pad for doing this next big thing I want to do. So there's some overlap and there's some advantage, and it's so easy to talk oneself into that.
So true.
Down. I have felt this sensation. That is not the path you're supposed to be on. That is not it. It's a parallel path. And the problem is, when we remember from your basic mathematics, is that the definition of parallel lines is two lines that never meet. And so even though a line may be very close to the path you're supposed to be on, if it's just parallel, it's still not the path. And so I had to finally make the trade-off, and I have done that about 2 months ago, really firmly decided I'm not doing the book. And that's when it got real. That was game on then, because now I suddenly had the resources available, the time, the space, the energy, and the will as well, because now I've given something up so significant. I really have to do everything I can to be successful at the venture I think is really the next big one for me.
Part of what I love about that, you and I were talking about Cal Newport before we came on too, and talking about deep work. And I think that if we're going to see those breakthroughs and if we're going to make our greatest contribution, we've really got to open up space to do that. And it means all this other stuff that's good and valuable and important, some of that's just not valuable or important for us. And we have to say no to it to create the space to have the breakthrough thinking that we need to really move the needle on the projects that we're called to do.
Well, this is so true. I mean, it's all about cutting, eliminating, editing. One of these words, there's a couple worth sharing, but one word that I think is interesting, if you go back to the root, the Latin root of the word decide, you find it's the CID or CIS, which is the root word also used in scissors, fratricide, homicide. So to decide originally meant to cut or to kill. And so that's just been lost in our modern vernacular. That's not how we use the word today. Well, we're going to decide what we are going to do. But really, that's not real until you've eliminated something. So I've run strategy sessions all over the place with all sorts of companies over the years. And they're quite good at, here are the 2 or 3 things we want to go big on.
Right.
But that isn't at all the same thing as saying, and we're going to take resources away from this other set of projects that are also good, but are not the ones that we need to be invested in right now. That's where strategy begins. That's the real work of leadership, is making hard trade-offs that some people aren't going to like, but you still need to make them, because that's what's going to propel you to break through to the next level.
It's fascinating to me, and I can't remember, honestly, if you used this example in Essentialism or not, but Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple,
right,
faced with just a plethora of products and paring that down to the essential few and really focusing on those and look at what happened to Apple.
Yeah, it's 330 products when he came back. He reduced it to 10, which is a really extraordinary level of elimination. And then, of course, that was the resource pool necessary to be able to break through to the next product. Suddenly, there was bandwidth in all sorts of ways. There was the resources to create the next product. There was the marketing resources that weren't being utilized trying to sell all these 300 different products and get that word out. And so they could focus the messaging and so on. So it's true that Apple, no doubt at all, that the turnaround was only possible because of this constant disciplined pursuit of less but better inside of Apple. But I'll tell you a story that I like connected to Steve Jobs, even more than the turnaround story, because we've sort of heard that story before, but is somebody who said no to Steve Jobs and lived to tell the tale. So this is actually a little earlier on in Steve's career, when he had been just fired from Apple. So he goes and starts his next venture, and he wants a great logo to match the one that he'd had at Apple all those years. And so he goes to Paul Rand, who's one of the top logoists of our time, did ABC and Bloomingdale's and a bunch of other iconic logos. And he brings them together for a meeting, and he starts explaining how it's going to work. And you can imagine Steve Jobs' kind of level of drive and level of insistence that would have taken place in that meeting. And he said, look, you're going to get me a bunch of options. I'm going to tell you what I think, and then you'll just drop a few more for me. And then and he starts explaining all this. He listens for a while, and then Paul Rand says, no. He says, I will solve your problem for you. I will bring you one solution, and you will pay me. That's how it's going to work. And Steve, listening to that, sort of must have believed him, had enough credibility to pull this off, and went with that solution. Of the experience, Steve later said, he brought me a jewel of a logo. One solution totally solved my problem. So he paid him the $100,000, but then added this important insight for the rest of us, which is, he said, Rand was the ultimate professional. Why? Because he thought through the value creation exchange that we needed to have more deeply than I had. So that's really important reasoning there, because it's not that we need to somehow become noists and say no to everybody and be unhelpful in our lives. No, it's to think through what's the value we can best produce in any given situation, and make sure that we tap into that as fully as possible so that we can make overall a significant contribution. So this is an Apple Steve Jobs related story that I like.
Well, it brings to mind also the role of courage in living our lives. And because that seems like a very courageous thing that Paul did. It was a very courageous thing that Steve did when he came back. Cutting is never easy. It's much easier to accommodate. So what is the role of courage in all this? And where do you find courage kind of in the warp and woof of life when you're getting more requests than you can possibly field?
Well, I think first of all, I agree. It is about courage. And I didn't intend to write a book about courage, but there's no doubt that is inherent in the story of becoming an essentialist. But where I think it grows from, what these essentialists that I interviewed and worked with, I think it grows out of the yes. So it's out of clarity that you get a sort of clarity-driven courage. So again, the distinction between noism and essentialism is that it's focused on what is essential. So one has to actually get to that level of clarity. I couldn't just say no to the book deal. I had to say yes to something else clearer and be sure that that was the path I needed to be on. And once somebody can get to that level of clarity, then it gives you fire for the deed. And it doesn't make the journey easy. Actually, it can still be very hard indeed. But this is why it's a disciplined pursuit, right? It requires something strong. But that clarity can see you through, and you keep coming back to your why, and you come back to your purpose all along the way. That's where I think the courage comes from.
That's very good. Well, we've defined essentialism, and indeed the subtitle of the book, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. We talked about some of those disciplines, but what are some of the disciplines we haven't talked about that will enable us to live lives that are more on purpose and on point?
Well, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of creating a system ultimately that makes execution of what's most important as easy as possible. So there's two ways of thinking about this idea of discipline. One is sort of to muscle your way through. When somebody's talking about a new diet or something, they say, this time I'm going to be disciplined. I'm going to discipline my way through, as if they can will themselves to greater will. And what we've found in the research is that that's not so easy to do. And that what's more accurate is that we wake up with a pretty given amount of discipline currency. And the question is not how much do we have, but how do we use it? So a non-essentialist tends to use their deployment of currency, their discipline coins, to make and remake the same decisions. They're so reactive to everything. So they're waking up, should I run this morning? Oh no, I don't really feel like running. Or maybe I should run. And every decision is like this. So what it means is that very early on, left with this sort of decision fatigue. So like by 11 o'clock in the morning, you've tried to make so many decisions and be back and forth on so many different things that you're just spent. And so then you're surfing the web. Then you're on ESPN or whatever the website of choice is. And so that's one way. The essentialist takes a different approach because they know that discipline itself is a finite resource. They use that resource to build a system, a routine, a way of operating that means that they don't have to make the decision again and again. And so there's, for example, it's a CEO, the longest serving CEO, I think, in Silicon Valley, maybe even in history, 35 years as the CEO of a company he started. And when I got talking to him, I was trying to work out, well, how has he managed this longevity? How has he managed to be successful over this time? I mean, he turned $300,000 of his own money into $500 million. So this is like a significant success in the business world. And he just said, ultimately, it's routine. It's not the only thing, but he has exactly the same routine. I'm saying like six days out of 7, every week for 30 years. He's got up at like 5:30 in the morning, and then he does an hour workout, and then he does this thing and that thing. And so here he is, mid-70s now, and he can still, I don't know, do handstand, like walk on his hands. He can still do one-arm push-ups. I mean, because he's followed this routine. He drives to work at the same time. He always brings a packed lunch, never eats out. This is part of the routine. Now, I'm not saying that's the routine anyone else wants to follow, but the very act of creating a routine he doesn't have to think through every single day, multiple times a day, has saved him tremendous energy and resources. So that's an example of what we mean. And what I'm saying when we say create a system that makes execution easier than the knowledge-based approach.
Another kind of funny example that won't be for everybody. It's not for me, but Steve Jobs had that a similar decision where he decided what he was going to wear. It was going to be jeans and a black turtleneck, and that was it. And that was his entire wardrobe. So it made it very easy to get dressed in the morning.
Yeah, and this is the whole key: is to figure out the things that you're fine with putting into a routine, the things that matter less to you, so that you can focus on the other things that matter more. Of course, that's going to be different for each person, but what's the same for every person is that we have a finite amount of discipline. So if you just try to use it for everything, you will run out of it before the end of the day, and that's when our decision making it will be worse. I mean, this is very deeply established, correct idea that we will run out of discipline as the day goes on. Yes. So, for example, one of the original research into decision fatigue showed that if you want to be tried in the morning for a crime, not in the afternoon for the same crime. You will get worse punishment in the afternoon than in the morning because people just get blunter and less. There's less energy with which to discern the right path forward. So we should know this, embrace this about ourselves, and therefore build systems that remove as much of that noise as possible.
That's very good. Okay, so I want you to imagine for a second that you're consulting one-on-one with a busy executive or a business owner. Yeah. He looks at his calendar. He knows he's overcommitted. He knows he's on the edge of burnout. Maybe he's starting to see some of the physical symptoms. What would you advise that person to do? I know you'd have to know the nuances and all that, but what would you typically advise some of the first steps for people that are in that situation? What should they do?
Well, I think that in support of this idea of the personal quarterly offsite, I think that the second cadenced meeting that ought to be created, and I would just hold the first one with this executive, is the weekly design. A week is just a perfect design module or period where you get to, you get to spend a day. I mean, it's pretty well established that you take a day over the weekend to try and take a break, if it's the Sabbath on a Saturday or Sabbath on a Sunday, depending on faith. And if somebody with no faith at all, it's fine. You can still hold a sense of, I need some time to create some space. And so choose on a day, a period of time, an hour or two, to really look at the calendar for that week and design it and say, what's essential? What's really on here? What can I uncommit from? Where do I put that space back into my life to sleep again? How can I make sure that I'm, put some buffer on the calendar for a change where maybe 2 hours a day, as much as that, is never scheduled, so that whatever comes up that you're not expecting, has a place to be able to sit instead of just being translated into stress as it otherwise will be. You look on there and you literally go through every single thing on that calendar for a week and ask yourself, what is the impact if I get rid of this meeting? What happens? Who do I hurt? I mean, every no, generally, most no's do have a negative consequence for somebody, but what's the consequence? And can it be rescheduled later? Can it be delegated to somebody different? How can I deal with each of these as gracefully as possible? So I think that it's instead of this reactive, almost literally minute to minute, or sort of at least checking my phone way of decision making, we look at least at a week. If somebody can learn how to design a week that really matters, then they have a credible and reasonable expectation that as long as they can repeat that process, that they can live a month that really matters, and a year that really matters, and of course then a life that really matters. So I do think that this idea of the weekly planning segment, I mean, of course everyone's heard about this idea before, but really scheduling time every week, holding that sacred, is a way to start getting back into control of a life that often feels like it's living us.
That's excellent. What about when you get a request? I'm talking about you personally. What do? You get a request by email or a phone call? I ask you to do this interview. How do you process that so you don't regret the decision later?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the idea of having clear criteria is important. Trying to work out, for example, a rule of thumb idea is the 90% rule, which says if you get a request and you're thinking, well, it's pretty good, it's probably a good thing, I probably should do the thing that's good, then that's maybe a 6 or a 7 out of 10. And that's where we get into trouble. If something's a 1 out of 10, maybe it's clear to us it should be a no. But a 6 or a 7, that's pretty good. And so what I try to encourage people to do and try to do myself is go for a 9 out of 10 or above. Like if it's not a definite yes, then it becomes a no, maybe even a definite no. And so when requests come to me, I mean, I do have certain systems now set in place. So there's a series of requests that come in that are media requests of some kind, a conversation like this, or and a variety of other things. And so I have a certain amount of time set aside, about a day a month, as it turns out, for media, a media day. And that's been very helpful because then there is a forcing function which says, well, as soon as that time is full, the answer can still be yes, but it's the month after.
Yes.
And so you have there's enough space because I think it's a valuable, essential activity, but it doesn't take up too much time. Mm-hmm. And nor does it interrupt every single day, which is another risk where you're just jumping into different modes and putting on different hats so often throughout the same day, you can become exhausted. So I think that having a criteria that sets a very high standard, and then also having a back-end system that says these kinds of activities easily slot into these time zones help to both be able to say yes in a helpful way, but also create a boundary for how much yes of even a good thing one is going to pursue.
That's terrific. I think one of the ideas I picked up from you in Essentialism was whenever there's a request, to put a space between me and that request so I can process it. Because I know this about myself. I know if people get to me and ask me, I'm getting better, but I'm still recovering. They get to me straight away. And if they ask me, I will say yes. But if I can remember in that moment to say, you know what, that sounds interesting, but send me an email and I'll let Susie look and see if it's a fit. Yep. And so I at least give some processing time so that I'm not caught flat-footed.
Well, it's something I've found that's helpful and I've played with more even since the book came out is the idea of yes with these conditions. Because I think I agree. When somebody asks you to do something, I'm done with a keynote and then somebody comes up afterwards, hey, could you do this? Even after having just talked about essentialism, it's awfully hard when the person is a foot away from you and really excited about something to simply say, well, no. I mean, and I'm not sure that essentialists do that. I'm not sure that that's really what I learned when I interviewed them. What they did is they would often say no without using that word. And so yes with conditions is a form of this, where you say, yes, I'd be happy to have a look at this. send this email to this person. They're going to have a look at that and see what the possibilities are and aren't. You've led with a yes. You are being open, but part of that openness is also openness not to do it. Part of it is that I sent an email response to somebody just this week, and I did a yes with conditions. I said, yes, I'm happy to do this thing, as long as all I have to do is give you a thumbs up approval. Like it's just a rubber stamp and it's done. If it's more than that, I have to decline. And actually, they got back to me and they said, oh, actually, I've learned that this takes a lot more work than I originally thought, so you're off the hook. And I thought that was a pretty good little success story.
That is a good success story.
Because I was still being helpful. I was not being, completely rejecting someone or just not getting back to somebody. But it was within the range of what I could actually, allow for the request that they'd made.
One of the ways I deal with this, particularly by email, is just to say to somebody, man, I would love to do that, but in order to be faithful to my current commitments, I'm going to have to say no. And I've had so many people write me back after getting that message and saying, thank you. I mean, I can handle a no. And first of all, thanks for being an example, because I realize that I need to be faithful to my current commitments too.
I love that. Say the phrase again. So you write them and you say, what's the words?
I'd say, thank you for your request. I'm flattered that you ask, but in order, and this is the key part, in order to be faithful to my current commitments, I must say no. And then I usually try to give them something helpful, like point them in another direction. Yep.
I think that this is a lovely example of the graceful no. Of course you have. I mean, what you're really doing in a way with that answer, which I really like, is you're drawing attention to the reality of your life and everybody's life. Of course you have current commitments, but unless you bring it into the conversation, it's as if people don't know that that's true. And especially if they're coming to you and they don't know you, they've seen your blogs, they've read your stuff, they're whatever. So they have a relationship, but only at a distance with you. They don't know what your life is. They have no idea what you have committed to already. And so unless you tell them, unless you sort of involve them in that, it can feel like, well, it's so easy. All you have to do is do this little thing for me and it makes such a big difference to me, as if your life, their request exists in a vacuum.
That's exactly right.
It's another trick of the non-essentialist. The non-essentialist wants you to believe that every request exists independent of every other request. Yep. That there's, again, no trade-offs involved in this. If there were no trade-offs in requests, all of us ought to say yes to everything that people ask us to do. If there's no trade-off, we ought to do it all. But again, there really are these trade-offs. Bringing trade-offs into the conversation, highlighting that reality, is a very truthful way of having conversations with people.
Well, your point about it just being one seemingly small request without any context, I often see this, and I get this like you get this, and that is people ask me to give them an endorsement for their book. Mm-hmm. And what they don't realize is that's, from their perspective, it's just 2 or 3 sentences, right? But from my perspective, it is, I've got to read the book, and that's going to take hours. Right. And then I've got to decide based on that, I've got to write the endorsement. So I've found that it's about a 10 or a 12-hour commitment to say yes to that. And so am I really willing to trade that time? In some cases, yes. And I'm happy to do it. But just the review is something that is very time consuming. So you got to consider it carefully.
There's no easy answers to these questions because we're dealing with people, and all of us are sensitive. All of us are vulnerable. All of us want everyone to say yes when we make the chance to go out after people. And all of us have been helped by other people. So there is a tension here between trying to help and be useful, but also recognizing that we have other ways of being useful. It's pretty early on in our lives that we max out on the number of ways in which we could be useful in a given day, right? Like if you had to, I was just talking to a very smart, driven, successful guy on Sandhill Road here, where all the investment firms are and the venture capital funds. And he said to me, when I was reading Essentialism, he said, I realized there was something wrong when I admitted that if I had 300 hours a day, I still couldn't do it all. So he's saying like the expectations on him are more than 10 times the available time. Depending how you add it, maybe 20 times. So that's true, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that anyone who's capable, driven, and successful faces that very quickly. So it's no longer enough to simply say, is it a good thing? Therefore, I say yes. I mean, that's sort of the default criteria. Is it good? Yes. Okay, so I should do it. If that's what we do, then we will simply be reactive to a lot of other things. I mean, I'll give you another little thing that I like. This is from Adam Grant, who wrote Give and Take. And he talked about 5-minute favors. And I like this, the idea that if you can do something for someone in 5 minutes, then you can schedule those together. So you might schedule 2 or 3 hours in a week, which is your give back time. And you try and do all those 5-minute favors people have asked you to do. And you feel good. You've made a difference to people and you've helped people. But you've got to know whether you can do it in 5 minutes. And maybe that's part of this yes with this condition. Yes, as long as X. As long as you can solve this problem and this problem and this problem for me. So all I have to do is this thing. If you can turn a request that originally might have been an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, have no boundaries to it, into a bounded request, then maybe you can be useful in a smaller window.
I love that. Well, Greg, I could talk to you all day, but there'd be some trade-offs to that for you and for me. So just one last question, and that's what's next for you? What are you excited about that you're working on that is going to take your attention the next several months?
Well, I mean, the big thing is I really, and you can tell I'm hesitant to even talk about it, but I really want to figure out a way to create a TV show. Yeah, there, I've said it. And there's some things in the works with that, but I'm frank to say that it's a very new area for me. And I have to figure the whole thing out, but I can feel unquestionably and undeniably that this is the thing I'm supposed to do. So it could be that the whole thing doesn't work, and it could be that the whole thing's a failure, or it could be, I don't know. But I do love the feeling in life when you just get the sense, this is the way, walk in this path. When you just know that sense of it, then if you fail, it's okay. You sort of fail in glory in a way. And if it doesn't work at first, that doesn't matter. It's still the right path. So until it's the wrong thing, you just keep going. And as I think about the last 17 years, the writing and teaching path, it's been full of those moments, absolutely full of moments where you go, oh, this will be the path. Oh, no, it isn't. You try and do this project. Oh, it doesn't work out. You start writing that book. Oh, you don't like to do it. You don't want to do it after all. I've got so many stories of that along the way, but what was consistent was a sensation. This is the right path to be on. And it's the same now with television. And I think it might be the same 17-year journey. I just have no idea what to expect, but I feel like I'm committed to it until I feel otherwise. So yeah, that's the next big thing. We'll see.
Well, I'm excited about that. And you can count me among your first viewers. Now you just need a few thousand, tens of thousands more, but I think it'd be fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fantastic, as always, and I can't wait to talk to you further. And thanks to each of you for joining us. I really want to encourage you to read Greg's book, Essentialism, and to visit gregmckeown.com, where you can connect with Greg and find out more about his incredible work. Now, I want to encourage you, if you heard something today that was helpful, some strategy, some tip, put it right to use and let us know what that is in social media. Just tag it with Free to Focus. And by the way, if you do that, you'll automatically be entered in the contest to win free premium access to my new course, Free to Focus, Achieve More by Doing Less. So again, thanks for joining us. And a special thanks to EA Help, our sponsor. Stay tuned for a special message from them and more from the Free to Focus Summit. Thanks.
You have 475 unread messages. You have 24 unheard voicemails.
Are you managing too much? An EA Help virtual assistant is the solution. We handle the details so you don't have to.